Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Comics. Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Comics.
Captain's Log, Stardate 76967.3. These are the voyages of the podcast We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. Our continuing mission to explore strange new comic books, to seek out new characters and new story arcs, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White. And this is a clean comic book podcast where we discuss and review comics by DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast, pretty much everywhere else.
And because it would be really difficult and annoying to listen to the whole podcast like this, we're just going to, I think, talk normally now. But we had to get it out of our system, so we
Hopefully
did.
so.
But according to my tricorder readings, I believe that we should check out, or you should check out, our website at bonelesscomicspodcast.com that has more information about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, and a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch video episodes and find additional bonus content.
You will probably find it all fascinating.
Logical. It's very logical to check out our YouTube channel.
Yes,
there you go.
is.
The dictates of poetics.
So if you haven't figured it out, the dictates of poetics.
Command you to look at our website.
There's a deep cut Star Trek Voyager line there. So if you haven't figured it out yet, we're talking about Star Trek Year 5 today, which is published in 2019 by IDW, written by Jackson Lanzig and Colin Kelly, and a writer's room including others, and penciled by Stephen Thompson, Martin Cacciolo, and Sylvia Califano. And just a note before we get into the writers proper, there are actually two other writers on the issues that we read, but the primary narrative that's kind of like the through line that's running through all of it all is by Lanzig and Kelly. So that's why we're going to kind of focus our energy there, because there's a lot of creatives involved here. So
yeah, so kind of like a typical episode, they have a writer's room with a bunch of people where they kind of work on the ideas and pitch them together. But the first story arc was actually written by Lansing and Kelly, so it seemed like a good place to focus.
Right.
So both of these writers have worked on a ton of comics actually together, including Captain America and Guardians of the Galaxy for Marvel, Batman and Green Arrow, among other things, for DC Comics, and a slew of other properties. But some of the notables I saw were like Tomb Raider. That was kind of interesting. And then, of course, Star Trek, because here we are today. They also not just worked on the original series, but they actually just finished a run on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where Sisko returns after season 7 of the show ends.
Oh, wow.
There's actually a hardcover edition, couldn't find a paperback, of volume 1 called Godshock, which is available for pre-order and releases on July 18th, 2023. So very recent, and also sounds really interesting, and I'm interested to check that out on my own time.
Yeah, I for sure want to check that out. If I haven't said it before, Deep Space Nine is kind of like my sweet spot for Star Trek. So moving on to the pencilers, we have Stephen Thompson, who penciled issues 1 and 2, Martin Cacciolo, who penciled 3 and 4, and Sylvia Califano, who penciled 5 and 6. So it's kind of mimicking the TV production process in that you have a writer's room, you have somebody that's kind of driving the overall story, but the director might change from episode to episode, the camera operator might change from episode to episode. This is sort of one of the rare instances where they're intentionally doing that in a comic book. It's not because of like a scheduling issue. So I actually think that works a little bit better, since they're kind of trying to imitate TV episodic production here. So anyway, we start with Stephen Thompson. And there is another Stephen Thompson that spells his name with a V instead of a PH that I found online. That's
Stephen with a V.
Yes, a key animator with Disney. So he's also a penciler. He also does art. And that confused me for a while, because I was like, I can't find Star Trek on his resume anywhere. Where is it? But two different guys. So this is Thompson with an MPSON. And this one worked with Peter David on his adaptation of Star Trek New Frontier, which is the novel series which features Commander Shelby and Robin Leffler as returning crew members from the Next Generation show, as well as I think all the rest of the characters are original characters aboard the USS Excalibur, I think. So
Interesting.
he also has worked on Star Wars Republic back when Dark Horse Comics had the license to Star Wars. So, and he is from Dublin, Ireland. So we actually have a very international cast of pencilers this time because Martin Cicciolo, who did the next 2 issues, is from Colonia, Uruguay. Previously, he worked for DC on their Sinestro title during the Godhead crossover between the Green Lantern titles and the New Gods, which you probably have read. I might have loaned you those trades years and years ago.
Yeah.
It's sort of the tail end of the New 52 Green Lantern stuff.
Okay.
He is currently working under an exclusive contract with Marvel, however, where he's handled a multitude of books, and currently he is on Deadpool. So
Nice.
There you go. He gained critical acclaim for his work on a Magic the Gathering comic book series, also published by IDW. And then finally, we have Silvia Califano, who is an Italian artist who's contributed to many varied series over the years. She worked on the UK published 2000 AD Regened, a title designed to introduce Judge Dredd and his related characters to younger audiences.
Okay.
So it's not like, I guess, as bloody and violent and as adult as like the main Judge Dredd thing. It's sort of like a gateway to get kids interested, and then when they get older, they can read.
Then they can watch all the blood.
Then
and
they,
the violence.
then they can
okay,
watch
cool.
all the violence. Yeah. So she also teamed up with writer Brandon Easton, who wrote the, I believe, the second 2 issues in the collection we're reading today, on Judge Dredd: False Witness, published here in the U.S. by IDW. Her jobs in the U.S. have also included cover work for Dynamite Entertainment on their Elvira in Horrorland series, as well as other Star Trek and X-Files books for IDW. And if there's a theme coming up with IDW here that you're noticing, it's that like 90% of their comics are licensed comics, which is really interesting to me. I just, as sort of an aside, after having read all these credits, I'm starting to wonder, like, when those licenses expire, like, are they going to be okay? Like, because that's kind of like all they have going. And the big news recently is they lost Transformers and G.I. Joe to Skybound Entertainment, which is the company that the creator of The Walking Dead owns.
Wow.
So they actually just lost those to him, and he's doing a lot of crossover with those characters and stuff. So
they
anyway.
probably do everything they can to try to retain those licenses. But
I would assume,
with everything else,
yeah.
it probably comes down to the lowest bidder, because that seems to be the way businesses run. But we're not here to talk about real life businesses. We're here to talk about Star Trek, the original series, and the voyages of the USS Enterprise. So we have a roster of characters that really are from the original series. So if you've seen that, you should be somewhat familiar with these characters, but just in case, we'll go ahead and cover them anyway. So we have Captain James T. Kirk, who's the commanding officer, and he really is the kind of shoot from your hip type, but he also has this kind of like, almost like discernment, where he can see what's going on behind the scenes and put things together. Like, he is very, just perceptive and able to see what's happening.
Yeah.
And that counterbalances his first officer, Commander Spock, who is a Vulcan, who's actually half human, but he denies that side of himself. And he focuses on logic and science, and everything is very much like either by the book or just by the numbers. But he also has this like almost soft spot for Kirk, where he kind of like will defer to him anyway and be like, well, this is what logic says, this is what science says, I've given you, essentially all of the numbers, now it's up to you, and he'll respect his decisions. So it's kind of a neat dynamic that they have. And then sort of as part of the not a love triangle, but maybe like the bro triangle, is Dr. Leonard McCoy, who's the chief medical officer, and he's very much the gruff, I don't really care for logic. I mean, he cares for science because he's, a doctor, but he, I don't really care about, all of this other stuff. It's just, I want to make sure that the people are taken care of and that everybody's okay. And I'm going to make fun of Spock along the way. And that's kind of he's not a comedy relief, but there's certain instances where maybe he functions as that here and there, but he's a serious character.
And I just wanted to add that Dr. McCoy also has a habit of basically inserting himself into command level decisions where the Doctor
True.
really has no business being there. So he ends up being kind of like the sort of like the ship's counselor role that we'll see later in TNG for Kirk specifically, where he's coming in there and he usually has kind of an emotional perspective, but it's also a very like morally grounded, like, well, this is the right thing to do, darn it, and that's what we need to do. And then
Yeah.
Spock will offer his, and then Kirk will usually take a little bit of both of those and be like, okay, maybe there's a solution somewhere in the middle. So while Kirk can be really impulsive, he does definitely rely on the opinions of his officers to,
Right.
inform his decisions. So
And Dr. McCoy being a counselor is not like Counselor Troy from
No.
TNG, but it's more like, I don't know, he's like sandpaper, basically. He's
Yeah.
he's very gruff, he's very abrasive, but he's not wrong a lot of times.
Yeah.
So he'll call it as he sees it.
Mhm.
And then we have Christine Chappell, who is a medical officer. We have Montgomery Scott, who is the chief engineer. So if you've heard, beam me up, Scotty, that's Scotty. Although Kirk actually never says "beam me up, Scotty" in that exact way. So, but that's a little Star Trek trivia there.
Yep.
But we also have Nyota Uhura, who is the communications officer and actually has a decent role in this comic that we'll get into a little bit. We have Pavel Chekhov, who's the navigator and the security/tactical officer. Hikaru Sulu, who is the helmsman. And then we have other characters such as the Tholians, which are a kind of Star Trek staple here, especially from TOS, and they are a crystalline-based non-humanoid species from the Alpha Quadrant. So they're very different than typical aliens that you would see that maybe are just humans with different makeup. Like the Tholians are completely different, and they were actually seen in the original series episode, The Tholian Web. And lastly, we have characters from Sigma Iosha 2, which is a planet in the Beta Quadrant where, from the Star Trek TOS episode, A Piece of the Action, where a Federation starship contaminated the development of the species by leaving behind a book called The Chicago Mobs of the 20s. And so naturally, the society took on the aspects of the Chicago Mobs of the 20s. And if you haven't seen it, it's a very interesting episode, and you should definitely check it out. Maybe after, you listen to this episode, because we need those numbers. So
Yeah,
make sure you
for
stay
sure.
tuned.
It is kind of a proto Prime Directive episode that doesn't mention the Prime Directive by name, but it's a concept that will then kind of be taken with Next Generation and other shows and fleshed out more fully. So.
Yeah, they call it basically like a non-interference policy in the episode. And so the starship that intervenes, they didn't really have that policy when that starship was there. So that was kind of part of the problem. But I don't know if they call it the Prime Directive in TOS or if it's until we get to TNG that they actually name it that. But it's essentially that non-interference policy where, this is a lesser developed society and we don't want to influence them, and we don't want to say, hey, we're the end product, so why don't we just give you everything we have and you can be just like us. Like, no, they need to develop on their own. They need to figure out who they are and what they want to do with themselves. And if they want to do space travel, then we'll certainly, do business with them later.
Right. Well, so today's story is actually divided into 3 separate 2-issue mini arcs. So 1 and 2 are very much a continuous narrative, although the narrative from 1 and 2 carries as like the B story throughout all 6 of these issues. And then we have 3 and 4 which are another, almost like another episode, and then 5 and 6 are like another episode. So it's very much structured like actually not like a 1960s season of television. It's structured more like a modern network television show like The Flash or Arrow, where you have kind of an overarching narrative that's happening behind the scenes, but then you have one-off episodes that are happening on top of that. So that's kind of what you're signing up here for with this story. So in issue 1, on the eve of the USS Enterprise's final year in space, Captain Kirk learns that he'll be promoted upon the ship's return to Earth. But as he grapples with what that will mean for him, the ship receives a distress call from a Tholian colony, who have been completely wiped out. The only life form remaining is a single Tholian child, whom Kirk decides to bring aboard the Enterprise. And so Kirk has kind of like a hunch about this, that like there's more than meets the eye. I'm not trying to make a Transformers reference. Yeah, but
that's me transforming.
More than meets the eye. Kirk's hunch is soon confirmed. by Scotty and Uhura's analysis. The Tholians destroyed their own colony using a weapon that inflicts extreme cold. And actually, we get to see them fire this weapon on the Enterprise and kill like 5 crew members or so, which is pretty awful. So, while Scotty and Uhura develop a proper defense, Kirk decides instead to escape from the planet, fearing that they'll be responsible for more loss of life themselves. So then issue 3, we kind of take a turn into like more episodic Star Trek. Having escaped the Tholians and created a stable habitat for the Crystal Child, as they call him, or her, at this point, the Enterprise ends up back at Sigma Iosha, a planet that had previously been stuck in the Industrial Age, finding them testing their first warp drive. So after beaming down, the Enterprise crew learns that the Sigma Iotians have elevated the Enterprise crew, specifically Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, to godhood. With I forget what they call them, the progenitors or some, I don't know. They have like a name for them. But various factions on the planet have various ideas about how to progress their society, but it's all based on Dr. McCoy leaving his communicator there in the TOS episode. And so now that this society has like studied that, and instead of the Chicago mobsters being like the cornerstone of their society, now they've studied this like Federation history, basically. So this is a direct sequel to an episode of TOS. Also, Kirk's old flame, Carol Marcus, informs him that he won't be allowed to meet his son, David, on Earth, which is kind of foreshadowing for events that are going to happen in the movies. And then back on Sigma Iosha, a captured Spock decides to assist the Iotians in their space program by running for office. So that's a pretty big cliffhanger there.
That was, I'm like, is that really logical though? Is that really, I don't know. I feel like we could debate the logic of that decision.
Yeah, we can get into that when we get into the story analysis, but we'll go ahead and get all the sort of like the narrative points out of the way first. So Spock alleges that the Northern Iotians aren't providing necessary resources to those in the South, to which the Northern Iotians agree. So the ruler of Iosha believes it's only through conflict and having an underclass that progress is made, continuing the Iotians' oversimplified look at human history. So this is like kind of what they do. They take something that they find from another culture and they go, let's make ourselves all about that. But they like don't dig very deep into it. They just kind of do like a surface level copy of it. So the people on this planet have 6-week terms as president, and there are 47 candidates running for president on the planet. Yeah, which, if you're a Star Trek fan, the 47 has significance there.
Metro Enterprise, I believe we have our 47 reference for this episode. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Get
we
out.
do.
Okay, continue.
So meanwhile, Scotty deals with an attempted mutiny from Ensign Sati, who's lost a sister to the Tholians and feels that they shouldn't have the Tholian child aboard. Uhura actually finds a way to communicate with the child, nicknamed Bright Eyes, by showing it pictograms of mathematical constants, like the mathematical golden thread or Fibonacci's constant, I believe is what that's called in math. I don't know anything more about it than that, so don't ask me about math.
Math no babble.
Yeah,
that's what they showed him.
I don't. It's actually funny, and we can talk about this later. But there's quite a bit more technobabble in this than TOS would traditionally have, which is kind of surprising. So Spock wins the election to president back on Sigma Iosha, but abdicates his seat, instead leaving the Iotians with 3 texts on how to govern the people: The Republic by Plato, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass, and The Teachings of Surak from Vulcan. Then the Enterprise leaves the planet for Hesperides. So again, very common thread with the original series. They sort of have a really simple solution and they're like, here you go, we fixed your problem, and then they just leave. And they've already done that with this planet and they're doing it again. So there you go. Now finally, issues 5 and 6, the Enterprise arrives at Hesperides and they are excavating some ancient artifacts, while the crew begins to act strangely and have communication breakdowns and even outright brawls with each other. So Kirk decides to put Uhura on that issue since it involves communication. But just as she leaves Bright Eyes, he begins to speak in Federation Standard, which to all of us is English. So what Uhura discovers is that what the Enterprise is experiencing actually isn't a breakdown in communication, but it's like a telepathic field that's been generated around the ship by one of the artifacts, including their Tholian guest. So the fights breaking out were the result of people's thoughts being heard aloud instead of their words. And if people don't speak their minds, their words will be misunderstood. So there's even a part, I think, where like Kirk says, it's a cat, but you want me to say it's a dog. And he's like, well, what I said out loud was it's a dog. And they're like, no, we heard the other thing. We heard what you said.
But then they
what you
played the
thought."
log back and he actually just said it's a dog.
Right.
So the computer confirmed that he just said dog. He knew he
Right.
just said dog, but everyone, they heard it. They all heard it together. So
yeah. So it's
yeah.
it's interesting where like their minds are reading something different than what they're hearing.
Mhm.
So this becomes further complicated when a Klingon bird of prey shows up
Of course.
out of nowhere. So although it's kind of barely an inconvenience because Kirk gets them to leave the Enterprise by telling them that there are mind-reading ghosts around. And actually we see this play out on the Klingon ship, and the commander like kills one of his officers because he thinks the guy's trying to take his seat.
Yeah.
And they eventually return all the artifacts to Hesperides 1 in order to preserve the crew's safety. And finally, our story concludes with Uhura finally able to program linguistics for the Tholians into the Universal Translator. So, very much it's not an end point for the overall narrative. I'm assuming that it takes all 25 issues of this series to play out the whole Tholian plot, although I don't know. But we do get, kind of a sense of where that story is going here. So,
yeah. All right. Well, with that said, and all the story stuff behind us, let us watch this short clip and then we will get into the discussion. We'll be right back.
Risk. Risk is our business. That's what the Starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and jump into it in a little bit more detail here. And what I wanted to actually start off with there were a bunch of Easter eggs just in like the first, I don't know, like 4 pages that I thought were really cool. So some of these things are themes that are going to sort of foreshadow events in the movies, because Star Trek Year 5 is very much like bridging some of that time period between the end of the original series and Star Trek the Motion Picture in 79. So Kirk finds out that he's going to get promoted once this tour of duty is over and they go back to Earth. So he's going to be Admiral Kirk. And McCoy actually reminds him that he shouldn't destroy the one called Kirk, because he's like sort of in his ready room or whatever, like feeling sorry for himself, or, not necessarily excited about, the promotion, which again is a theme that's going to carry forward. And Scotty actually even mentions that he's gaining weight, to which
I could have done without that one.
Yeah, to which Spock mentions something about like, yes, you've gained like 37 pounds since our journey began or something. And I was like, geez, that's like really hard.
You keep tabs on everyone like that. Hey, I noticed that you gained 8.3 pounds since 2 years ago. You better start watching that. Like, step off, bruh.
Right. Like, Spock, you've been on this ship for 5 years with humans now. Like, you should know by now, like, there are certain topics you don't want to bring up. So, but what it does do really nicely, and the Carol Marcus part I mentioned earlier, it actually serves to do this in a later issue. But what it does really well is it establishes right where we are in the Star Trek timeline really quickly. So we know that we're past the events of the original series. We know we're kind of moving into the movie timeline, but we're not there yet. So that's really cool. And there actually even is a callback to Star Trek Enterprise, because Kirk mentions that he was dropped off at planet Tarsus, where he lived part of his life, by a freighter captain or something named Mayweather on this like Warp 2 vessel. So my assumption is that was like a very old Travis Mayweather from Enterprise. Otherwise, why would they, drop that name? But I don't know. I just thought that was kind of it was nice that they were able to establish really quickly, like, okay, here's where you're at. So if you're a fan, like, you know exactly when this takes place.
Well, and give you a couple of cool like callbacks or just,
Mhm.
interconnective tissue here and there, but without like beating you over the head with it. Like we didn't
Mhm.
have to have a Mayweather character who then has to explain his lineage and, make all these references to Enterprise and blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah. Like we didn't spend a lot of unnecessary time dealing with this. It was more just little mentions that if you notice them, they're cool little Easter eggs that make it feel connected. If you don't notice them, it really doesn't ruin the story. So
Mhm.
it was kind of nice to do it that way.
Yeah, I think it was cool, and I think that including Carol Marcus, especially, even though it was just like a couple pages of dialogue, was a
Mhm.
really cool thing to sort of show. It really mirrors like the journey that Kirk is going to be going on in the movies. Seeing that like he has this family out there, but he can't really be a part of that either. It's the same reason that he can't really be a good admiral, because the captaincy is really how he defines himself as a person. And like when he's not captaining a starship, like he doesn't know who he is. And that's
Yeah.
really something that ultimately I don't think he resolves until like Star Trek Generations. I mean, he's really kind of like struggling with that issue throughout all the movies. So
Well, and I
yeah.
don't know that he necessarily resolves it in Generations either, because he chooses he could stay and well, and this is kind of going off on a tangent on
Sure.
Generations, but he could stay and kind of work all of this stuff out just for his own personal sake of, I need to know who I am
Hmm.
aside from the uniform, and I need to explore these past events to discover myself. He really
Hmm.
could have taken an opportunity. Again, it's not real, so none of it would have like had any stake or actually change anything in the real world, but it could have been like a journey of self-exploration. But instead, he decides to leave the Nexus and leave this potential like immortality, go with Picard on a mission, basically as a captain, and he gets
Yep.
killed in the line of duty. So it doesn't
Yeah.
really get resolved. He just ends up, getting killed doing the same thing that he always did and loving every second of it, except for the
I
dying
mean,
part.
and that's what's interesting about that. And they really briefly mention Carol in the story, and they show David, his son.
Hmm.
What's interesting about that is that ultimately it seems like Carol is making the right call with being like,
Yeah.
I'm going to raise this kid away from you because you're always going to go back to space. You're always going to do your heroics. And like, I know you too well to think that you're going to be like the settling down type. Like, you're probably going to try it. You're going to be fine with it for a while. And then you're going to get restless. And then you're going to be like, well, what am I doing with my time? And you're going to want to go back out and have adventures. And so that sort of like search for meaning is definitely like a core part of Kirk's character, that like he can't find it outside of being the
Yeah.
captain of the Enterprise. So it really showed to me that they understood his character, that they were like including that right up front in this story.
It's
So
interesting too, because like the perspective that we have is looking back on these
mm-hmm.
Star Trek shows. And I feel like the whole like David Carroll, Jim Kirk thing, fit a lot better and made more sense than the whole Jack Beverly Picard thing that we got in Star Trek Picard.
Yes.
But I kind of wonder if that's because we're looking at, stuff that was 20, 40 years ago versus
Mm-hmm.
looking at Picard that's now. And it seems like it's just kind of out of nowhere. I wonder if people watching Star Trek to The Wrath of Khan at the time and those movies thought the same thing of like, why are we doing this? And why does he need the sun? And what does this mean? I don't know. That would be an interesting perspective to have, but
That's very interesting. That's a thought that had never occurred to me, that there might be people that were like, this is adding unnecessary elements to James Kirk's
yeah,
backstory.
because I just feel like in Picard, it's just like kind of it's out of nowhere. It's not handled very well,
Mm-hmm.
and you're just supposed to care. It's like they throw stuff at you, and they're like, "Here, care about this," and you're like, "I don't. I don't want to. I want to see the Enterprise D like we
Right.
got with season 3. I want to see the TNG crew together, and I want to see the
Mm-hmm.
Enterprise D. And the story doesn't have to be phenomenal. I just want to see all the characters back
Yeah.
together after this many
Mm-hmm.
years." And it just felt like it fell flat. Whereas this, with even the little bit of
Mm-hmm.
foreshadowing with David and Carol, like is kind of giving a little more substance to what we see in the movies, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of neat.
Yeah, well, it what it honestly reminds me of is with Star Wars last time, what we were talking about how the supplemental
Star Trek reminds you of
material.
Star Wars. What kind of world
Yeah,
are we living in,
yeah,
Mike?
I know, but how you were talking about how a lot of the supplemental material was kind of filling in gaps that the
Yeah,
movies weren't providing. This very much feels like that, where it's like we're adding in some context and backstory that maybe you didn't see, but that fits right in with where the original series crew is going to go from here.
right.
So, um, we have talked a lot about Captain Kirk and sort of the journey that he's on. That's obviously not going to be resolved in these comics because that has to play out in the films.
Yeah.
But what did you think about how kind of everyone else was handled in the comic?
You know, like I read the comic and then I actually went back and I watched the TOS episodes, the Tholian Web and a piece of the action. And because I wanted to get a piece of the action by watching the original series episodes.
Right.
But actually, like I thought they were very consistent. I thought they did a good job capturing them, at least with the writing. The art was something interesting. Like I liked how the way that they were drawn, that they resembled the actors, but they weren't like a one-to-one. They were just a little bit different, that they were kind of like somebody's interpretation of the actors. And I felt a lot more comfortable with that than them actually being like real exact recreations. But
yeah,
I noticed there were a lot of inconsistencies with poses. And I wondered if that was because they were creating their own version and they weren't sure, or if it was because we had so many different artists on. But sometimes you'd get like a close-up shot that would look really cool. And then you get a faraway shot and it's like, I'm looking from panel to panel and I'm like, almost looks like a different dude right there. Like that doesn't look like Kirk as much as that looks like Kirk.
Yeah, so there is a little bit of visual dissonance. And I think a lot of that really started for me with issue 3 when we got into, I'm sorry, Martin Cicciolo, but when we got into his work, really just the posing of the people was a little bit stiffer. And I've looked at some of his other work online and it's very much like superhero, big, bold action kind of stuff. That's not really what you're drawing on Star Trek. So I understand that he was probably told to like pull it back, but it was the figures looked almost like too stiff, where it was like there's like no motion or movement going on. So I don't really know that there was a good answer to that, but it definitely wasn't distracting enough to me that it like took me out of the story or anything like that.
I noticed it because I was reading it and I was thinking about things I wanted to take notes on and things I wanted to say about it. And I noticed that and I'm like, that looks kind of weird. But that was the end of it. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, this is the worst art I've ever seen. I can't read this, you know. Nothing
well,
like
and
that.
also I think most of the time you can recognize who everyone is, and that's the most important thing. If you can tell who's speaking, you know, you're going to be good most of the time. And I think Spock, everybody kind of nailed, but he's probably the easiest one because he has very distinctive, like, well, you're going to give him the ears, you're going to give him the eyebrows, you know, and everything. And so even if you're doing that and it doesn't look quite like Leonard Nimoy, you're still going to be like, well, that's Spock.
Right.
But with the other guys who are all human, you know, it's a little bit different.
It's kind of like when you're watching an action movie and you see a very, like, for a split second shot of the back of somebody's head fighting, and you're like, I can tell that that's not, you know, so-and-so's head, it's a stunt double. You know, it's something like that, where for a second, it kind of takes you out because you notice that it's not consistent, but at the same time, you're just like, it's really not that big of a deal. It's not like I'm watching a giant, you know, rubbery green Hulk or She-Hulk who's just like, moving all rubbery, and you're like, that just looks bad, you know?
Right.
Or The Matrix Reloaded, like we talked about several times in the last couple episodes, where it's just like, we instantly switch to a video game and you're watching, you know, 30 seconds of this like footage that's just not rendered very well. You know, it's attention like that. Whereas this was more just like little snips here and there. I was just like,
yeah, it was fine.
William Shatner.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that everyone's voices were really like spot on, especially for some reason Spock, McCoy, and oddly enough Scotty was one where I felt like just the tone of how he was delivering his lines and stuff, like I could read it and actually be like reading it in his voice, and I was like, this fits. He would say it like this is how he would deliver that information, you know. And they did even
I cannot guarantee
like
that we'll be able to do it, but you know, I'll give it my best.
Yeah, I mean, they did have his dialect kind of written into the dialogue a little bit, and some of them, which they also did with Chekhov, I noticed. Although that seemed to fade away a little bit more after the first couple issues.
Chekhov's was more like a couple words here and there, whereas I felt like Scotty's was like, you know, one word per sentence, kind of like a lot more.
Yeah. Let me get me bagpipes, or, you know, something. He didn't say that. But,
no. Let's not go there. So one character that I'm just messing with you. One character that we actually kind of got to hear more from than, maybe we did kind of in the original series was Lieutenant Uhura. And that was kind of neat to see her kind of have more to do, but also have a lot of lines. Because when I rewatched the Tholian Web, her role basically was almost like a damsel in distress, where she was in her quarters and she saw Kirk, because at the same time the Tholians are like slowly building this web in three-dimensional space that it seems like you could very easily get out of, except the Enterprise's engines aren't working, so they can't escape, and all they can do is watch these Tholians weave this extremely slow web. At the same time, what's happening is the USS Defiant is like floating in and out of our reality, and so Kirk gets stuck over there, and so they think he's dead, they're not really sure, and so he appears to Uhura, and he's in a spacesuit, and he's just kind of floating, and he's like mouthing something, but you can't really make it out, and so she sees him, but nobody else really believes her. And meanwhile, everybody's kind of losing their minds on the ship, so it's like, she's just another one losing her mind. And then later, everyone, starts to see Kirk, and they're like, oh, I guess Uhura's not crazy at all. Hey, guess what, Uhura, you're not crazy. And that was kind of the extent of what she got to do in that episode. And I know she's got to do more like in the movies and here and there, but this, I felt like she had a really like legit, like strong, almost like a lead role, at least the scenes that she was in, or the panels, like she was doing something that no one else could do, that she was heavily specialized in, and that they could not have moved the plot along without her. Like she was a very valuable member of the crew, and that was like really cool to see.
Yeah, it was very, so it's so funny because what it's doing is something that really the next generation would be more characterized by, right? Which is, we're going to pick out a character that's not necessarily the main character, and they're going to be featured for this episode. Where you have Worf episodes, and you have Troy episodes, and Dr. Crusher episodes, and they're not like the main characters of TNG. I mean, very much that's Picard and Data, but they all get kind of their time to shine, and this felt like that for Uhura. And it was really cool because I think it was a huge missed opportunity on the original series for them to not spend more time with that character, because when we get to Star Trek Enterprise, we have Hoshi Sato, who's their communication officer, and there's a lot of things about like her communicating with things and finding ways to communicate when nobody else has any idea, because their universal translator is like barely functional. I mean, it helps them with like the Vulcans and maybe like one or two other species, but other than that, she's having to like program in stuff as they go. So this is obviously 100 years after that, but it's nice to sort of pit Uhura, their language specialist, against a problem that is not like so cut and dry. Like the Tholians can communicate with them, no problem, but they can't communicate back, really, at least not with this child.
Well, and that's
Sorry,
the funny thing is, like, this is 100 years after Enterprise, and it's like maybe almost 50 years after Star Trek the original series. So we're talking, not only is this something that a thread we're picking up and characters we're picking up 50 years after the show premiered, but also it was such a different time period that we're talking about in the late 1960s, early 70s, and even into the 80s, that it's like this character, probably the most they could think to do with her was typically what you would see a woman's role in films back then, and then also communications officer. And in TOS, where everything was very technologically advanced, at least for the time, it was like the universal translator just works, and it translates pretty much everything, and we don't have issues with that. So there's not as much for Uhura to do other than just sort of relay messages like a secretary, unfortunately. But I think it was one of those like post Roddenberry decisions where it's like we start bringing in those imperfections, and we start bringing in the dissonance and things that Roddenberry, that wasn't part of his vision and wasn't the direction he wanted to go. But we have those things to where now the universal translator, it doesn't translate everything. There are difficulties with it, and there are times where the communications officer actually needs to do something and actually needs to be a skilled linguist to be able to perform that job. But I think that really makes for an enhancement of that position, because otherwise, why do you even need a person? And you could literally just, hey, it's a cell phone or it's a speakerphone, and somebody says, hey, we're being hailed. boop on screen. Okay, why do you need a whole officer at a station to go boop on screen?
Well,
when
and that's
the
why they
captain sure has
eliminated it,
controls.
for Next Generation. That's why it was gone.
Exactly.
In TNG, they just put it at Worf Station, and they're like, "All right, you answer the hails."
But that was the neat thing about TOS,
Yeah.
or this comic for TOS, and then also Enterprise, was like the communications officer has a very important role in exploring, new civilizations, new life forms, new cultures. Is we don't automatically speak the same language, and we need somebody who has that very distinct skill, which there aren't a lot of people to fulfill that role. And so it was really nice to see Uhura be able to do that in this comic.
Yeah, and I thought that the way that she began to communicate with the Tholian kid, well, I guess Bright Eyes, we'll just call them Bright Eyes, because that's what they name them. I thought the way she started communicating was cool, where she brought in like different objects to see if it would respond to any visual imagery, because they have no like linguistic similarities at all.
Right.
And then she showed it a picture of like a mathematical constant, and it knew that. And I think it was Spock that said something about like, fascinating, they're made of like geometric shapes, and so they have this innate understanding of like geometry and mathematics or something, apparently. And I was like, that's actually adds like a nice little wrinkle of information about the Tholians, which Star Trek has been around since the 60s, and we really don't know that much about.
No.
So it's really cool that this comic was able to take that species that we hear them referenced a lot on not Next Gen necessarily, but I know Deep Space Nine references them a few times. They have sheets made of Tholian silk at one point or something. Things like that. But it was cool to take that race that we've always heard about but not really seen much of, and actually try and like build it out a little bit. So
well, and they're so different from us that like their whole perspective and approach to language is completely different, that you have to, instead of trying to dissect a language like you normally would as a linguist, you have to just completely start from scratch. I mean, when you're like, hello, can you understand me? And the response is, no, you're just like,
I think that's about what they sound like too.
Exactly.
The text boxes were very interesting with like the squiggles and all kinds of stuff. It looked like they actually had the penciler just draw something in the text boxes for the Tholians. So
and then when they actually spoke Federation standard, there were these like, it was kind of like sharp, jagged edges, almost like geometrically shaped letters for their dialogue that we could read in English. So that was neat too.
They sound kind of robotic in the TOS episode, right? They have kind of like a robotic, like, this is the Tholian assembly, that kind of a thing going, which
we will give you 1 standard Earth hour. We do not appreciate deception, so we will fire on you.
Yeah, that's the other thing I was going to bring up, is that episode, again, it's so cool that we see more of this species here, because that episode introduces a really cool race, but we're really more concerned with like the sci-fi thing that's going on of like the disappearing, reappearing dimensional shift thing, and like getting Captain Kirk back. And that is more the focus, as opposed to like learning about this new species that we've run into.
It seemed like such a weird interjection. In the episode, and it kind of feels like that in the comic with the Klingon bird of prey showing up. It's just kind of like, why is this here? It's kind of just an annoying thing to kind of pad the time, and then we get rid of it. And now we're back to what we were doing, especially in the episode where the Tholians, like I said, they're just like slowly making this web. And I guess the idea is to show that we have this like impending doom of like, we need to wrap this up. Whereas if Kirk is just kind of in and out, it's like, we'll grab him on the next interphase, whenever we get a chance, no big deal. But now that we have the Tholians, there's that escalation of like putting some heat on. We need to do this right now. So maybe that was the same idea. I don't know.
I mean, the crew's brains melting wasn't enough incentive for them to need to go quickly.
Yeah, that was pretty brutal, and just like right through the hull and everything. And it didn't damage the ship at all. It's like, basically, we have a beam that won't destroy your ship, but it will cook your people from the inside by freezing them till they disintegrate. So, that would be amazing for the Pakleds though, because they could like just vaporize the crew, and then they could take the technology, and then they would have things to make them go. Because that's what they want, right?
That would be perfect for them. Red alarm.
Yes.
Captain
Red
Janeway.
alarm!
Um,
You're
every-
not Enterprise.
every female officer that beams down, Captain Janeway.
No, you not Janeway. Okay, we digress.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, as far as like the overall narrative that's going on, I thought it was great. You know, the stuff with the Tholians, the stuff with Uhura. I mean, I really appreciated seeing her get more highlight. I think they did in the Kelvinverse movies push her a little more to the forefront. I think in like Into Darkness, she's the only one that can speak Klingon, you know, or something like that. But again,
or without a
it's-
translator, it's like if
Right.
you find yourself in a situation where you don't have a universal translator, then
Right.
you know she's the only one that communicated. Yeah,
Right.
making her more edgy and kind of pushing that relationship with Spock and all
Right.
that stuff. Like it
Right.
just that just to me felt like we're adding stuff to the character to make them more edgy, but it's not necessarily to make the
Mhm.
original character better. We're just going to kind of
Yeah.
have our own, you know, modern sexy version.
Right. Yeah. This very much is the 1960s Trek with, I guess,
Just
more
like told
modern,
in a modern way, I guess.
Yeah, just told in a modern way. But it still really keeps that tone of the show intact.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's really nice. So I guess with issue 3, that plot turns into like the B plot, and we go into what is basically the TNG template for storytelling, where we have like the A story, which is Spock, McCoy, and Kirk beaming down to Sigma Iosha 3, and you know, trying to investigate the political stuff going on there and them developing warp drive and all that. And then the B story is Uhura up on the ship trying to, you know, communicate with the Tholian, and also Scotty dealing with a potential mutiny from one of his engineers. So
yeah, this to me felt a little weird in comic format, maybe because I wasn't expecting it, but it seemed like an RPG when you're playing a side quest and the main quest is like, we have to hurry to this point or these people are going to get killed and it's very important. And you're like, okay, cool. And then you go to the side quest and they're like, hey, my cat is missing. Can you go find my cat? And you're like, sure. And so you level grind and you go find the cat and you make some gill and then you come back and then you're like, okay, now it's time to go do that urgent thing that was immediately pressing as if no time has expired. That's what it felt like to me, was like we had this very important thing that was happening and then it was like, we're going to just pause that right now and now we're going to go explore this thing and then we're going to come back to that later. But you know, like you said, it's kind of a more of a TV trope, but I felt like it was a little weird in comic format.
It was odd because you do expect comics are always serialized. They've always been serialized. I mean, maybe not in like the 30s and 40s and stuff where you can just pick up any issue off the rack and, you know, it doesn't matter. But really, since the Silver Age, comics have been sequential storytelling that takes several months to complete. So, yeah, that's what you expect from a comic book. So it is a little bit odd when you get to the next episode and like the A plot has now been backgrounded for this other thing that's going on. Although I did find it really interesting and cool that they're following up on another TOS episode, because that is the thing, is that like we never see what happens to these places like after the Enterprise leaves, except on the show Lower Decks. Like that's the only show that ever does anything
Second Contact
with that. Exactly, Second Contact, where they're like, oh, you know what, so the Enterprise did this and then they just left, so I guess let's see if the people are okay, you know. And so it was kind of nice to like follow up on that and have them go back there. But again, it was kind of a similar story to like what they did in the TOS episode before, where the people have like taken this thing that they got from Earth or from Starfleet and they've developed a whole culture around it, but it's given them like this massive technological explosion in this one.
Yeah,
unfortunately,
like very massive.
Yeah, like they went from 1920s America to like the late 21st century, because they're developing warp drive, although I think they said it runs on like nuclear power or something
like that. Yeah, but they look like the Phoenix rocket from First Contact, so they're like trying to make their own First Contact, but they've already had First Contact, you know, ages ago.
Right,
but they're like it's kind of like those, I forget what the term is for it, but where you see like modern technology, but it's all like steam powered and it's
Mhm.
made using super old technology. Like that was kind of
Yeah.
the thing that they were doing, is they were mimicking what Starfleet had, but it was like in kind of a way that wasn't exactly, you know, the same, and it
Mhm.
wasn't with the same technology, so it didn't work quite as well. But it was interesting, like, to see kind of a follow-up from that, especially because at the end of the TOS episode, you know, McCoy's like, hey, I think I forgot my communicator, and they're like, oh, this is probably a big deal, that's not so good. And the way the episode ends is Kirk going, well, that's not good, they're probably going to want a bigger cut next time. And then the screen like freezes on him, and then that's just the end of it, because at the end
It's
of
like
the
a funny wow.
yeah, exactly.
Like
And they're just like, ah, well, you know, we just further contaminated the species. That's cool. Well, who cares? Move on to the next episode.
What's funny is there is a whole Enterprise episode named The Communicator, where Reed leaves his communicator on this planet that's in the middle of like basically our equivalent of World War One. And they have to go back down and like try to find a way to retrieve it, but they actually end up doing more damage to the society and almost like revealing that they're aliens and all of this stuff because they're trying to get their technology back. So
Yeah.
it's funny that that show is supposed to take place before the original series, where in the original series they're like, screw those
No
people,
big
it's
deal.
fine.
They'll
Yeah.
figure it out. But at the same time, maybe
So-
they learned from that lesson of, well, you know, there was this issue where the Enterprise,
Yeah.
previous Enterprise, you know, created a bigger issue. So I guess when you leave something, you're done. You don't go back.
It really is like you get to the end. So I've seen that episode more recently than I've seen a
Sure.
piece of the action, but I just watched it like, I don't know, a couple weeks ago randomly. It was on, and it really is. They get to the end of the episode and they're like, wow, we caused more damage by going down and trying to retrieve that than if we had just left it there. Because now the other side in this war thinks that their opponents have like this advanced technology and they're going to be trying to develop like, you know, interplanetary communication systems and energy weapons and all this stuff,
Yeah.
whereas they didn't know any of that existed before. So
Well, it was kind of like they were
Yeah.
doing in the TOS episode, where they're like, bring me some of them fancy heaters. That's what they call
right.
them, the phasers that they wanted. And they end up having like a demonstration of power by having the Enterprise in orbit fire stun beams from their phaser arrays in orbit down on the street level and like knocking out all these guys and making them unconscious. And that's kind of how they demonstrate their power. But
right.
I think they do that in TOS a lot, where they're just like, we've already contaminated them and they're looking to us for guidance.
Right.
And so we can't really tell them, hey, look, you know, we're going to stay out of this. It's up to you. We're
Yeah.
going to give them a directive and then we're going to back off. So we're going to say, look, we're the
Mhm.
ones in charge. We're the big bosses, but here's what we're going to do. We're not going to stay here and manage this planet. So we need y'all mob bosses to get together. He's head boy now, to steal a Harry Potter reference. I'm head
Yeah.
boy. And, you know, these guys are, you know, your backups and you all need to work together. And so they sort of set that thing up and then they leave.
Mhm.
So
It's
rather,
a very strong difference between Next Generation and TOS,
Yes.
actually, right there in how they deal with those situations. Because Next Generation would be like, we want to be involved as little as possible. Like
Mhm.
Picard, late in the show, is willing to let people die to prevent
Yeah.
like
we're sorry we
contamination of their
contaminated
culture.
your culture, but we can't interfere any further or try to make anything worse. So forget that you know about us. We're out.
Yeah, that's pretty much how they would deal with it.
You need to figure it
there.
out for
So,
yourself.
I did think it was cool that they had Kirk and McCoy sort of on one side of the conflict on the planet, where those were basically the haves versus the have-nots. But
Mhm.
it was weird because the have-nots were like, we need to be all about space exploration, and you guys are forgetting that that's what our goals are supposed to be. And the haves were just like, well, we're kind of content to be here and have a new president every 6 weeks and live in luxury, and that's fine. We don't need to go into space. I don't know how that political system didn't like break down immediately after they implemented it, but
Yeah.
like 6 weeks is not enough time. Although Spock had some line about, it's not necessarily bad, Captain. All you need to enact change is the will to do it and the people to accomplish it, or something like that. And I was like, that's true, but usually when it comes to government, there's a lot of red tape and things take a lot more time than that. So
Well, especially if you're talking about more of like a dictatorship, or it's like you have a
Right.
presidency, but that's all you have, almost like a king and queen. It's like you
Yeah.
have a ruler, and whatever they say goes for 6 weeks. There's no consistency.
Mhm.
Like one person starts a program, and then another person ends that program and does something completely different
Right.
within the same quarter. It's like if you change managers or bosses at work,
Mhm.
and they're like, okay, I have a rule that we're going to do customer service this way, and then somebody else comes in, no, we're not going to do it, we're going to do this way, and it's just constantly changing like that. There's no consistency, and it's hard to function in an environment like that. So
Right.
that seemed to be the thing, and I think they actually conclude, like at the end of that story arc, that rather than having one person who is the sole leader, it's like they need to have kind of like those
Mhm.
additional branches to have that like checks and balances of one
Sure.
person says this, another person says that, and a third person says this, and then you all kind of discuss it as a group to come up with a consensus for the best approach, rather than have one person just pulling ideas out of a hat every 6 weeks and being like,
Right.
space exploration is the thing. Oh nope, now it's not. Now we're going to worry about food and crops. Nope,
Right.
now we're going to put away the food and crops, and now we're building ships.
Like maybe we need to do all of those things.
Yeah, just one at a time. Let's be methodical and organized.
Yeah, so I guess my only sort of doubt about the resolution of that storyline is Dr. McCoy taking his communicator and then Spock leaving the 3 thick books on government. Well, one of them is on about how it's not okay to own people as property, but the other 2 are like about government or how to form an enlightened society. Do we think that they're going to be smart enough here to like do something significant with that, or are we just going to have another problem the next time we come here?
Well, considering that the first book was about Chicago mobs, and the second was literally just a communicator that was technology, I feel like they
Right.
should be in a better place to, not just be exploring things on the outside, but let's look at the
Yeah.
inside. Let's work on ourselves as a people, because that was really what they needed to do, is not copy another society, but figure out who are they as a people and what makes them function and what brings a quality of life to this civilization, whether it includes space travel or not. I mean, there could be
Right.
plenty of races that like, we don't need to do that. It's not really that
Yeah.
exciting to us, and we're gonna, have this nice little society and lay low, and it's cool. So
Mhm.
they need to figure that out. And that's more of a TNG thing, where it's like, we give you the
Yeah.
philosophy, we sort of explain what, your decisions can result in, and then we step away.
Mhm. So the other aspect of these 2 issues, I guess, was the sort of attempted mutiny that was happening on board the Enterprise while Scotty was in command. And that was with an ensign Sati, who is the cousin of Aaron Sati, a judge that was mentioned on Star Trek The Next Generation. He is the father of Nora Sati, who is the Judge Advocate General of the Federation in the TNG timeline. So this was kind of a cool thing. And it actually links thematically to that episode of TNG, The Drumhead, because what happens in that episode is that Nora Sati is basically on a witch hunt for a Romulan or somebody that's betrayed the crew on the Enterprise. And she puts this kid on the stand and finds out that he lied on his application. He's not 1/4 Vulcan, he's 1/4 Romulan or something. And so
Oh,
she's like,
yeah.
well, we can't trust him. And Simon Tarses, that was the kid's name. But so that's sort of the whole, like, her xenophobia like takes her to this extreme where eventually she kind of ends up destroying herself in her own career. So it's interesting that like 2 generations before her, we have this guy who's an ensign on the Enterprise, and his sister was killed by the Tholians. So he's like, I don't trust Tholians. We shouldn't have this kid here. And he sets up like a fake warp core breach, basically, or makes it look like the Tholian is causing a warp core breach, and then is like pulling his phaser, like about to kill it or something. And it's clearly like a child. So it's
Yeah.
like you're not just like killing another sentient being, like you're killing a child. Like that's really bad. So but I don't know, did you think that extra layer of like linking it to TNG added anything to the story, or
I don't know. I didn't think so, and I really felt like the whole like oh, we see a Tholian and we automatically assume the worst. That
Mhm.
that old shtick is kind of just like, I feel like we've had enough of that by 2019 when this was written, and especially
Yes.
putting that into the original series where, I
Mhm.
think Roddenberry was very adamant about things like that, where we don't have these type of conflicts anymore because
Yeah.
this is a more advanced society
Mhm.
of people, as the human race, and also, the other races as part of the Federation. I felt like it was kind of like, maybe we shouldn't have gone that direction. It was a little extra thing in there that I could have done without.
Yeah, so we do the only precedent that we really have within Star Trek would be prior to this with Trip on Enterprise. Because like after his sister gets killed by the Zindi, like he
Yeah,
hates the Zindi. He wants to kill them. He's like, I
all of
can't
them.
wait till we get there and destroy them all. And but even him, like once they get there and they meet these people, like his hate starts to subside and he starts to realize like, oh wow, like maybe I was wrong. And that's part of like his character arc for that season. So I don't know. I don't know that it's impossible for this to happen in the 23rd century, but it didn't feel like it really felt like it was there to be an Easter egg, basically. To be like, hey, look, we've linked it to a next generation character that's on this show now, or I say show, on in this comic now. And I don't know. I mean, it was fine. It didn't really bother me. I think it gave Scotty something to do while he was in command of the ship, and it gave them a reason why they couldn't immediately like beam the captain and Dr. McCoy and Spock back up because but I don't think they would have come up anyway because they were involved in this political mess on the planet. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess talking like story structure overall, we did talk about it a little bit, but do you think that having like the A and B story thing is needed and or works for the original series? Because they did not do that on the show.
I thought that it worked, like,
Mhm.
especially reading it in this comic format. Like I said, it was a little weird where it felt like we put the overarching plot on hold and then kind of just
Mhm.
told a completely different story. Like the way it was handled felt like a little weird handoff when that happened. So
Right.
it kind of like jarred me a little bit. But at the same time, like having something that like, okay, we have this mystery, we're not sure what's going on here, and we've got this not prisoner, but we have this person of interest that we need to figure out what's going on, but there's nothing else we can do with that right now. So we're going to move forward with,
Yeah.
whatever else is going on. And then we have this side adventure and figure out what's happening there. And then while we were on the planet, Uhura was doing the communications thing and figured out a
Mhm.
way to communicate. Oh, but it's actually because of some phenomenon. And now we have a third plot. Like,
Right.
I felt like the idea of weaving these different plot threads together was good because especially when you go back and watch the original series, it's just like this thing is what we're doing for a very long amount of airtime. And
Like 50 plus minutes. Yeah.
yeah, like the difference between 1960s television and 2020s television is, quite a bit because everything's a lot more
Mhm.
paced, everything's a lot more actiony. People are very smart and they get to conclusions a lot more quickly than
Mhm.
they did in previous shows, and even, that they could in real life. It's like people are very
Mhm.
in tune with themselves, and when they have a upset issue, they're like, well, it's probably because this happened to me when I was a child and I'm holding on to this guilt that I've never released. And it's like, wow, you're very good at articulating these like deep problems that are very difficult for real people to handle. But anyway, that's a
Yeah.
TV trope.
It is. It
but
is.
but the differences in time periods now between now and the original series is so vast that like when you go back to watch it,
Mhm.
some of the episodes are a little painful because like you said, it's like we
Mhm.
spend 50 minutes and like I said before, we had the Tholians and they're weaving this web and it's just like
Mhm.
taking time and they're slowly doing it. Hey, let's go to the conference room and chit chat for like an hour while this, life-threatening thing is happening outside the ship. Like what? And then, hey, let's beam down to an alien planet and we're being held at gunpoint. But oh, hey, don't shoot me right now. Captain's log, stardate 9, blah, blah, blah. Like, who's making a captain's log when you're being held at gunpoint? Come on. And it's
I
things like
will
that that are
say
just weird.
I will say this is a comment that we're gonna, so everyone, you need to listen to the after show for this one because I have so much to say. but the captain's log, I believe, is an integral part of Star Trek.
Sure.
And I think that you need it in place. And without getting too deep into my thoughts about Discovery, Discovery does not do captain's logs. And I think that's a big red flag right off the bat. Just putting that out there. But they do not use that story device. So
yeah.
I think I would agree with you that I think that the story format works. I think that it is less jarring when we get into issue 5 and 6, because then with that story again is all about communication breakdown, or actually over communicating with people once they're communicating telepathically with
and it
each
sort of
other.
parallels that earlier Tholian plot too.
So that's more in line with what Next Generation would very much do, where they will have like a plot and a subplot, but usually, even if those two plots don't meet, which oftentimes they do, but if they don't, they usually have like the same theme running through them, where it's like, okay, this episode is about this issue, even if we're dealing with it differently with the B characters and the A characters. So yeah, once you get to 5 and 6, it feels more intentional. Like, okay, now we're kind of like weaving those two threads together. So I did appreciate that. And again, it was funny to me because I was thinking about it when I was reading it, going, oh, this is a bottle episode, which what that would be on a TV show is when they say you can only use existing sets for this episode. You're not going to an alien planet. You're just going to stay on the ship, find a story that you can write without costing us any more money. So there's no reason why you have to do that in a comic book. But it was kind of funny because it almost made it feel more like the original series, where I was like, oh,
that theme.
This is an episode where they're not going to leave the ship, where all the problems are going to be they're on the ship, and they're not going to like run into anything else that we haven't seen yet. So
yeah, it very much fit that theme of it's a type of episode we would see, even if we don't need to do that, because we're not going to save any money in a comic by using those old sets. But at the same time, like it really gives it that feel of you're watching the original series, but more of a continuation, and almost like a not a modern retelling like we saw with the like 2009 Star Trek movie and from there with like Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto, but more of like as if the Star Trek, the original series, as it was, with the same actors, the same age, the same props and everything, were just to have another season, but today.
Yeah. I mean, that's really the only thing that makes it feel super modern, is that Uhura gets a lot more, page time, screen time, than she would back in the day. And also that there's no concern about production value. It's a comic, so you can draw, everything looks as realistic as everything else.
Yeah.
I did feel like the art in issues 3 and 4, I wasn't so much a fan. I mean, I didn't dislike it, but it wasn't as good as the first two. And then when we got to 5 and 6, I was kind of like, oh, okay, this is, we're kind of headed in a better direction here, but it wasn't like super distracting to me. It was kind of funny though, because it is another, I guess, kind of story trope, and it's actually something that we see in the Tholian Web TOS episode, where like, oh no, something's happening to the crew, and they're like brawling with each other. Like that kind of thing seemed to happen a lot. Like it happened in the Trouble with Tribbles. It happened in, that episode where
or
it's
they're all ditching their clothing and going behind closed doors, because that was another weird thing that we had to do. Hey, let's do a callback to a TOS episode in the Next Generation. All right, the crew is afflicted by even Data, the android, is afflicted by something that makes him want to have relations with crew members. Yes, let's have an episode about that right out of the gates.
Remember how successful that one was, guys? Let's do it again.
Please no.
So it is funny because I don't know that like the communication issue and them having this telepathic field from the artifact necessarily was like super interesting to me. It still very much felt in line with like, oh yeah, this is a TOS type thing that they would do.
Yeah.
So
I thought so too. All right. Well, with that said, shall we move into final thoughts?
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Comic.
Captain's log, stardate. Well, it's the same stardate. Not much has changed other than we are wrapping up our final thoughts and ratings for this episode of We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones.
No, you have to remember the exact sequence of numbers that you said at the beginning of the episode. If it's the same star date and repeat it exactly the
Supplemental. Captain's log, supplemental.
Good work around.
I've seen a Star Trek or two.
There you
No.
go.
But anyway, getting into our actual thoughts about this, this comic for me, I'm just going to spoil the ending right now. It almost landed as a 5 out of 5 for me.
Wow.
Not quite. I would say I'll give it a 4.75 because some of the transitions or that first like A to B plot transition, like I felt like we kind of just like switched gears really heavily and I wasn't prepared for that. There's some minor gripes about the art, but I don't think I'm going to worry about that too much. I kind of wonder if I went ahead and read the entire like 25 issues, if that would increase or decrease my score, because I felt like we had a very good balance of this is the original series. It feels like the original series. It's the characters from the original series. It's everything that you could watch the original series episode and then read the comics. And it's very consistent with the tone of the show, but it's told in a way that is a little more modern storytelling. So we don't we don't change the original series and make it modern and then tell a story. We take the original series as it was and we just change the way we tell a story, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
because
100%.
I feel like that's what all of the modern shows have done wrong is, and you could even argue this with Enterprise, is that we tried to take something that was from a certain era and we tried to redo it and just update it. And every time we update it, we change it so much that we lose that original formula. It's like, so there are certain things that just work and they worked at that time, but they don't work if you just pluck them out and you try to tweak them, because now you're messing with the recipe of what made it so great. Like that's why the Back to the Future trilogy, there will never be another Back to the Future movie as long as the creative team that worked on that is alive, because they have all agreed that what they did in those movies, they really didn't do things that should have worked, but they did. And that trilogy is amazing and it stands in time. And then that's it. We're not going to try to bring it back again because it's going to get ruined if we do it. And that's why we have movies like when The Matrix comes out with another movie, or we have another Ghostbusters movie, all of the fan base gets nervous because we're like, are they going to ruin this thing that was amazing back in 2000 or the 1980s? And now it's 2023 and we're going to just completely wreck the whole formula of what they made this amazing. And we're going to say, oh, Captain Kirk and all that stuff they did on the Enterprise with those blinking lights and those hardware controls. Well, this takes place 200 years before that, or 100 years or whatever. And you look at it and it's like, this looks like the 26th century. This looks like the Enterprise J, not the Enterprise NX or Zero or whatever we want to call it. We'll just add another Enterprise in there, like, oh, another Enterprise came before Kirk. And so I have all of these complaints about modern Trek because of those reasons, where we're taking what we've done and we're calling it the same thing, but we're doing it differently. Whereas I feel like that's different than when Deep Space Nine and Voyager came out, because they at least weren't trying to redo what had already been done and just do it differently. They were doing something different. This is a different kind of Star Trek. Maybe you don't like the serialized Star Trek in Deep Space Nine. Maybe you don't like all the science-y exploration, Janeway morals of Voyager. That's okay, because it's a different type of Trek that, works for some people and doesn't work for other people. But when you take Captain Kirk and you have a whole different Captain Kirk than we've never seen before on an entirely different Enterprise that looks like it's 100 years more advanced, now you're messing with the formula. And that's where I have beef.
Yeah,
and that's my story.
But a 4.75 is what you're going to land on
in conclusion,
for the comic, because to be clear, the comic book is not doing those things. It's applying modern storytelling,
and that's why I liked it so much. That's why I almost gave it a 5. Because we're actually taking the original series as it was and telling modern storytelling, and it worked for me. Like they captured that recipe formula that was perfect in the original series, and they duplicated it in this comic, from my point of view.
Yeah, so I would largely agree with you, although I think I'm going to grade it down just slightly more, just because
4.65.
No, I'm probably gonna go 4.5. And the only reason is because that shift between issue 2 and 3 was a little more jarring for me,
Mhm.
especially when I was reading it month to month when it was coming out. I
Oh,
have waiting like an entire month between the issues. I got there and I was like,
wait,
why
what?
does the cover to this issue have nothing to do with the Tholians? Like,
Yeah.
you get to issue 3 and it's like, here's the campaign parade for it's I love that Bones is holding his head in his hands there as Spock is running for office. But I was just like, what are we doing? And then I got into the issue and I was like, okay, they are continuing the overall
Yeah.
narrative. But I think that the idea that they were dealing with the Tholians and communication issues was so strong
It was more
that
unique than the other ones where they were kind of
Yeah.
revisiting stuff too.
yeah, that was like such a good story idea that I was like, I would rather just spend time with that and have that blown up full bore. Now, that being said, I think they did a really good job of what you said, which was, incorporating very much like this is TOS and keeping it TOS while just going, maybe we can have a subplot while we're doing our other
Yeah.
sci-fi thing and have people on the planet. Maybe we can move the story along a little bit quicker instead of having them go into the conference room every 2 minutes to pad things out. So
They're about to fire on us. Conference.
yeah,
Pause.
and I really appreciate it. So one of the things that modern Trek does that this comic book actually does better is that they will like to drop references to other things and hope that the fans are going to be like, oh my gosh, but then they never do anything with it. Like it's just a reference
Yeah.
that's kind of like there for its own sake. And when they did it in this story, it felt like it was actually justified by the story and it wasn't just like sort of shoehorned in there to be a reference. Like I know you like season 2 of Star Trek Picard more than me, but I really felt like they got to a point in that one where I was like, all right, we're just doing this to do it so that the fans will be like, look, the shiny thing, but like the story that you're telling is not really that exciting. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I appreciated it. I'm not quite willing to give it perfect again, just because I think that transition was so clumsy there, but a 4.5 is a really high rating. And,
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting this season. We've probably given out more high ratings than we ever have.
I
Although
think we
we've
had a couple
we've
low
had
ones in
really
there.
high highs and really low lows this season.
Yeah.
So I think one of us landed on like a 1.5 for Adam's Family. So yeah.
I think one of us landed on a 5 for Berserker. So
Hey,
we've covered both ends of the spectrum. Hey, if you like it,
Very
you like it.
true. You do. So Star Trek Year 5 is a great comic. If you're a fan of Star Trek, the original series, definitely check it out. I think it will I think it's a worthy addition to the show and just kind of a nice continuation.
Yeah.
But as always, tell us what you think of the comic by posting on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else, including YouTube. And be sure to use the hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast.
That's right. So my long-range sensors are showing that next episode we are going to discuss The Mask, number 1 through 4, published in 1991 by Dark Horse Comics, written by John Arcudi and penciled by Doug Mankey. So this will be a very interesting episode. Make sure you tune into it.
Somebody stop me!
Until then, live long and prosper.
Lion Pro.
Notes! Jolly!